Hi, I'm Miss Maria. My class Junior Illustration emphasizes the use of traditional media such as watercolor and ink painting over a base of high-level technical instruction. My class is a really good fit for students who have their own ideas and really want to work on their own subjects that interest them, but over a base of walks through step-by-step critique and positive reinforcement that really relies on a base of traditional skill sets. Usually we start class with a 30-minute demo and then demo crit, and then we continue with a long-term project, which students usually spend 4 to 6 weeks on and is based on a subject of their own interest. For today's demo and crit, we are going to be talking about thumbnails and how we can create a composition for something that we want to spend a long time on, but maybe work out the basics of first. So for today's demo, we're going to be talking about composition and creating thumbnails so that we can get a preview of what our illustration is going to look like before we put a ton of time into it and make sure that the composition is working. So the materials I'm going to use today are traditional materials, but if you just have digital materials, feel free to follow along. Make sure if you are using traditional materials that you have something to color with. I'm going to be using a pencil, just a standard number 2 pencil to start drawing things in. And then I'm also going to be using acrylic ink. Acrylic ink is different from regular ink because it is waterproof, so you can go back over it and your washes don't change. I use the brand FW. Today I'm going to be using indigo. I like the color. It doesn't have to be this color. You can get black, you can get pretty much any color but yellow because yellow doesn't show up very well. Or you can use watercolor or something else. I have a very well used palette to put my ink in, which I'll be setting over here so you can see me use things. I like using a pipette just to transfer the water to my palette, but you don't need to use one. You can use a brush just as easily. I'm going to be using a couple different sizes of brush. My brushes are Raphael Kolinsky and Winsor Newton Series 7. You don't need to get brushes this fancy. You can get pretty much any kind of brush. The good brushes, when they are damp but not wet, are going to come to a point at the tip. If it comes to a point at the tip, then it's good for painting because it means you can get both a thin and a thick line. I'm going to have a paper towel so that I can wipe the ink off and get the amount I want on the paper. And I also have a dipping pen with a nib, which I can use for very small, precise lines. And it's up to you if you want to use this. This is completely optional. All right. I'm going to start by just putting some ink in my palette, but we'll start off with a pencil. And I'm going to put some water in these to get some different washes of ink. We talk a little bit more about how to use ink and watercolor painting and a few other mediums in class. But if you're not super sure how to use them, it's okay to just kind of wing it. Or you can use a different kind of paint. I have a lot of students that use acrylic, some use digital work. I've had one use gouache. We're going to go ahead and start with our pencil. We're going to start by marking out some boxes. Now these boxes don't have to be fairly big. The main idea with thumbnails, which is what we are doing right now to work out our compositions, is that they're fairly small. This is about maybe up to the second knuckle of my finger. I don't want to get too much bigger than that because these are mostly for experimentation. They're not supposed to be big. I'm going to do maybe 4 or 5 of these. So let's think about what our piece is going to be about. What is the main character? Now, just drawing a main character staring straight ahead or staring off to the side may be pretty to illustrate as a portrait, but we want to do something that involves a little bit more story. So one thing that can instantly create story is to make something that is interacting with something else. So let's have someone that is interacting with something else. This can be a person interacting with an environment, a person interacting with an animal interacting with an animal. There are a lot of different ways you can have somebody interacting with something else. And if you don't like drawing people, you don't have to. You can draw something you feel more comfortable drawing with right now. For example, you could do 2 cats. You could do even stick figures. Composition does not have to be detailed. But you do need to get the basic idea of what your scene as a whole is going to look like. So there are a few different kinds of composition. You can have a composition that is a triangle shape or an inverted triangle shape. You can have a composition that is a diagonal shape or a reverse diagonal shape going the other way. You can have an S shape, a circle shape, a C shape, some unbalanced scales or balanced scales. There's the cross section. And throughout that, if you're having trouble figuring out where to place things within your composition, you can use what's called the rule of thirds. So if you draw 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines on any thumbnail, on any size, the places where they intersect are good places to place important things because they're not so in the center that they scream, "Look at me," but they're not so off to the side that they feel like they're a framing element or in the background. And you can use that if you feel like. It's totally up to you. So let's start by sketching in a few of these different compositions and applying them to some of our ideas. So I'm going to say a character is meeting like a cute little animal. So let's start with the circle composition. That one's my favorite. So the circle composition I really like because it uses framing elements. So the first thing we want to do when we have a composition is we want to figure out what our foreground, middle ground, and background looks like and how our characters are going to interact within it. So say they are in a forest, I could have some trees as my foreground. And those trees are going to curve around, maybe I have some big tangled roots in here. And they're going to frame this area into a circle. And within the circle, whatever I place there is going to feel significant because it's being framed. Whenever you place something like within this, it's going to feel like that's what we're supposed to look at. So I'll say within this forest is a little forest clearing. And within the clearing we have a character. I guess if it's a little magical animal, the person should be magical. So I'm gonna say a little witch. And notice that I'm not drawing in details. Thumbnails are supposed to be really small and not very detailed. They don't have to have anything figured out. We don't have to have reference for them. Reference is when you look at a photo that is similar so that you know how to draw something, for example, a hand shape or a face. And I'm going to say the little animals like over here. It's got a little scorpion tail. And we can tell that's what we're supposed to look at. I'm gonna go ahead and make it kind of dark and maybe have the forest start again behind them. But I'm gonna be really general and kind of scribbly with it because this is a thumbnail. Thumbnails are supposed to give us a general idea of the composition, so the way things are laid out, but they're not supposed to give us any like really important details or even, you know, like the texture of the bark or whatever, which when we move on to our final drawings or even maybe our rough sketches, we want to add in. But for now, we're just thinking about the general shape of things. This is a really good way to work out a bunch of different ideas of the same thing and decide which one we want to go with. So let's go ahead and do maybe the V shape next. So this looks kind of like maybe like a mountain crevice to me. So I'm gonna say that like on a mountain crevice, maybe that's where she meets this creature. Or maybe our idea is a little bit more firm. Maybe it's still part of a forest. So maybe within the forest, we have, you know, like a bunch of canopies, because I want to show as much variation within things that are similar as possible. That's why I changed it just now. Got a bunch of canopies, and within that I have maybe the little witch is popping up like on top of a tree. She really wants to find this creature and the creature is stuck in a tree. Maybe the creature is in trouble and she's working out a way to help it. So I'm gonna stick the character in a tree, and maybe the creature, let's see, we'll have them over here. Maybe they're on a beehive and they need some help. So I'm gonna go ahead and just sort of like lay out the general shape of the creature. I don't even need to know what kind of creature it is. I just need to know that the trees continue here, and that maybe over here we'll have something in the background, maybe a mountain in the distance. Just to show that there's something there. We don't want to have any areas where there's just blank space, because usually in the world, you know, like unless you're on a super, super flat prairie field or something, you're not gonna have a ton of blank space in the background. Usually you're going to have something going on. So I know these two characters are significant, and then I want to put something in the foreground because this feels mostly like middle ground and background. So maybe I'll have, you know, like some rocks or something. Or maybe this tree is a little bit larger. All right, but there's our V shape. And reverse V shape. Let's see, maybe there's like a stump or a broken log, and we see like a bunch of sort of branches coming off of it. Oh, maybe it's like an upturned tree and these are like some of the roots. So you can tell that when we glance at these compositions, when we look at these, we can kind of understand where we're coming from and where these ideas came from. But these are all really, really good prompts for thinking of ideas. Because if I just said like, draw a witch meeting a little magical animal in a forest, you may not have thought of like an overturned tree with, you know, the stump sticking up out of the ground. But knowing that we were using this kind of composition inspired that. So on top of that, we might have, you know, the creature, maybe let's switch it up. Maybe the girl or the witch hasn't seen the creature yet. Maybe the creature is watching her. So I see the creature is curled up over here, and maybe the little witch is over here like looking down at something. Maybe she found some interesting mushrooms. And like I said, we need something in the background. So let's have, and in the foreground. So let's have maybe some other, maybe some of the brush from the tree. It's like moving in over here. And in the background, maybe we have some other trees that are overturned. Maybe this is like a phenomenon where a bunch of the trees were destroyed in this forest. She's trying to figure out why. If at all possible, the more story you can add to your piece, the more interesting and compelling it's going to be, and the more nuance it's going to add to your illustration. All right, and let's do one more. Let's do the S. There are a lot of things that make up S's, but streams are one of them, and they are very easy to do. But you can also do S's by like planting things, like something here, something here, something here, something here, and having us kind of follow that line visually. It doesn't have to be a consistent curve. In fact, let's do that just to show that that can work. Let's have a series of, you know, like stones or something. We'll have, maybe I'll have some things growing on the stones. I like the idea that the witch is searching for little mushrooms. All right, then I'm gonna have another stone here. I'm having it overlap behind this mushroom, because whenever you have an area where something overlaps, you create a sense of depth. Depth means the sense that something is 3D or moving backwards in space. All right, so since I've created this kind of S shape, I want to place some of my characters along it. So maybe the creature is sort of like poking up over here, looking at the little girl, witch, and its body could be moving back like that, like it's trying to be sneaky. And over here, we've created kind of like a space where we can add something in, like an empty space. So here, let's say, I'm gonna stick the witch's hat. I'm gonna say the witch is taking a rest. She's tired of searching for mushrooms. She doesn't realize that some of them are right there. So I'm gonna have her just sort of laying on the grass, staring up at the world with the tree canopy, I guess. Maybe one of her knees is raised up just to make her shape a little more interesting. And I'm gonna go ahead and pick a couple things that continue that shape, like some tree branches or some tree roots. All right, so now that we have our compositions, we're gonna go ahead and start coloring them in. And when we talk about coloring them in, I don't mean doing full tiny portraits. We don't need to do tiny portraits yet, but we do need to figure out what values we want these things to have. So usually, foregrounds, middle grounds, and backgrounds will have light, medium, or dark values. And when you change things so that each plane, like something in front of you, something kind of far away, and something very far away, has a different base value, usually it makes something feel like there's even more depth to it, even more foreground, middle ground, background, even more something going back in space. So I'm gonna go ahead and create some really light blue ink. And I don't think anything bright white is going to be in here. In the world in general, very little is bright white. Usually the sun, if you look at it, will probably be like bright white with a yellow glow. But unless you have like an active light source, you're probably not gonna have anything that's really, really, truly white. So we're gonna go ahead and just decide whatever the lightest value is light versus dark. Color is like red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. And saturation is intensity of color, like a muddy green versus a really saturated lime green. So value, light to dark, is what we're talking about right now. That's why I'm only using one color, because I don't want color to be part of this. So I'm just picking whatever I think the lightest color in a forest would be, and I'm gonna go ahead and fill that in. Maybe here we do have some things that are really light. Maybe there's a ray of light shining on the witch over here. And we move through and we separate that. Maybe there are a couple areas of light over here. We can do another one where the light is shining on the little scorpion dragon creature. And the rest of this can be fairly light. And that should give us an idea of what our lightest light is. If you work on white paper, it can be difficult to see things as light, but if I put this behind like a medium gray paper, which is like a neutral color that most things in the world are, most things in the world are not like bright white in comparison to what you're looking at. If we put this against a bright white, I know this looks a little bit dark right now, but it would look very light if it was under or behind a neutral color. So now that we have this, I gotta wait for that wash to dry. And then I'm gonna go back in and do the foreground and middle ground or background as I slowly pick out other values. So while we wait, let's go ahead and draw a little bit more. Maybe we can do another one of these. We could do maybe the unbalanced scales, which since it's a tree, or since it's a forest, I feel like trees are kind of the obvious choice here. Maybe over here. I'll see the little witch. And she's looking at a little dragon scorpion who is maybe curled up sleeping on a log here. And it's okay if the details are hard to make out or if they don't quite make sense. As long as you know what it is and can explain it to me in class, I can help you figure out the composition and make sure that it feels compelling. And so we have our two shapes. We can go kind of in the background and play around with some other shapes. But again, I'm going to leave them pretty indistinct because this is not a super important part of the composition. And I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on it, because if you do all of these for class, these are all your different ideas, you're only going to pick one idea unless you are an incredibly ambitious student. And usually this is how most long-term projects start. I have you guys do some thumbnails to get ideas. We pick one and then we continue on in different steps until we reach a fully finished piece that is very well planned out. Usually students follow along during this time. Sometimes I get people asking questions, and I usually stop a few times to ask if anyone has any questions midway through. I don't want people to be confused. But if you're in the class, feel free to call out if you are confused about something, or if you need any clarification, or if there's something in particular you're having trouble with. Usually after this demo is over, I have everyone upload their work so far to Google Classrooms and we go over it together. So you're going to get some individual crit on whatever you're working on. All right. And then at this point, as these start to dry, we're gonna go through and we're gonna choose whatever our medium value is. So I decided that my background is going to be light. So I'm gonna make everything else kind of medium, and then I'm going to pick a couple things that are dark, and I'll go over them after that. But just picking 3 values, and usually when you do your final, you're not just going to have 3 values that make up your entire piece, you're probably going to have 3 value ranges. So if everything is kind of bright, it doesn't mean everything is going to be the exact same value or lightness. It usually just means that everything is going to be a light value. So you can see the difference now that we've added 2 values. This is starting to pop out and the composition is really starting to come together. Again, I'm going to say, oh, you know what? We have a little spotlight on her. So I'm going to say this area is the light area. I'm going to make everything else kind of mid-toned and then find a foreground or middle ground dark area later on. So generally speaking, when you create a composition, your eye is going to be drawn first to the lightest thing in a piece, and then your eye is going to be drawn to the point of highest contrast. So if your eye is drawn to the lightest thing in the piece, think about what that lightest thing is going to be as you place your values, and make sure it's something that you want your viewer to look at. If you're trying to hide something from your viewer, maybe it's not the lightest point in the piece or the point of highest contrast. Maybe it's a second or third read. Second or third read is what is the second or third thing the viewer looks at after they notice this. But the lightest thing in the piece is going to be the first thing they notice, which is usually going to be your main character. So I'm trying to think about my main characters and what I want to stand out about them. For example, here I would like the witch to stand out, but I would like this little guy to be a second read. These people are first reads. These people are maybe second reads. I could have a little sliver of light, maybe on the beehive if I wanted this person to stand out, or I could make them a little bit darker. think for this one we had the little dragon scorpion as a first read. So everything else is going to be medium. Maybe a little bit of light on the curl too, but maybe just not quite as much. Could be a lower angle maybe. All right, and then we've done the same thing here, where that's our light tone. And you can see that we are careful about brush control. Brush control is like how much pressure you're putting on your brush and also how much ink you're letting out of it. So I'm really paying attention to what I want to draw attention to and to the different lines that I'm making. I was very careful about the edges here. So even if you're not careful about the specifics of what's in your piece, I want to make sure that when I glance at this, I can understand what your composition is supposed to emphasize. So here I can understand this is a lighter area than this area. Here I can understand this is the silhouette of the tree line, etc. All right, then I'm gonna just take some like pure ink. I think that's pretty much dry. And I'm gonna block in what I want the foreground to be, because that's gonna be my dark. And usually they're going to be levels of dark, and sometimes they'll be hit with bits of light, but usually either your foreground, middle ground, or background is going to take on a darker cast. So my witch character stands out here because she is not the lightest point in the piece, the mountains in the background are, but she is the point of highest contrast because she's an interesting shape that's standing out from this silhouette here. And once I've painted this, even if you can't tell what it is, as long as you can explain it to me and tell me about what your idea is, the general shapes and silhouette are much more important. That's what we're paying attention to at this stage. So the bottom half of this dragon scorpion is gonna stand out, and this witch is probably gonna stand out. And this will be a finished, they're called comps or compositions or thumbnails. And you could call this like a very basic value study. Remember, value is light to dark. Go ahead and place in the darks of the other pieces. And if you don't work as fast as me, feel free to pause the video. Everyone works at their own pace, and usually I end up doing more work in the demo than I expect my students to do. So I may do 5 of these, but I may tell my students to do 3 of these, and that gives the students some variety to look at if they're having trouble with their own work, but it gives them enough time to finish their work. I may have a couple areas of dark here, but generally speaking, I want to use what's called value grouping, where most of the values, like most of the darks, for example, are all in one spot so that the composition does not get confusing. As you can see here, I'm grouping this witch in with these other values. So you can barely see her. So for this one, the witch would be basically hidden. Whereas for this one, maybe I'll draw her out a little bit, give her some sharper shadows. But she's supposed to be out in the open. So one thing that composition can tell you is what's supposed to be hidden, what's supposed to be noticed, and what the general shape is going to look like and what's going to sort of frame what you want the viewer to look at. It shows me how you're going to lead the viewer's eye, and it's a really good place to start with illustration, because if you don't know where the viewer is supposed to look, you don't know what parts you're supposed to emphasize, maybe spend extra time on, maybe call attention to with color contrast. So these quick value studies or compositions or thumbnails are how we start all of our pieces, and I hope you were able to follow along. I look forward to seeing you in class.